The Wellington bomber trembled. The very instant the first German flak burst cracked open in the darkness, exploding barely 200 feet beneath its port wing. Flight Sergeant James Allen Ward felt the shockwave travel upward through the aircraft's frame, through the metal pedals, through the control column gripped in his freezing hands, and finally into his chest like a punch delivered by the night itself. It was the 13th of April 1941, somewhere above hostile German territory, where the night sky had suddenly turned from silent blackness into a killing ground of fire and steel. Another flak burst followed, closer, brighter, deadlier. A blossom of orange flame flared beneath them, illuminating the cockpit for a brief, hellish heartbeat before sinking back into total darkness. The air smelled of fear, cold metal, and burning cordite. Ward rolled the aircraft sharply to starboard, dropping altitude in a single sweeping dive. A Wellington bomber flying straight was a Wellington bomber dying straight. German flak gunners preferred predictability. If a bomber offered them a steady path, the next shell would slice through it like a knife. Through cloth. The Wellington serial number, R1333, carried 6 men and 4,000 pounds of high explosives meant for Hamburg's oil refineries. The aircraft itself was a masterpiece of geodetic engineering, designed by Barnes-Vollis. The latticework structure of interlocking duralumin strips could withstand punishment that would tear a conventional airframe apart. Many Wellingtons had returned to England with entire sections missing tail, sections shredded, wings torn open, yet that skeletal geodetic frame kept them flying when logic insisted they should have dropped from the sky. But no matter how brilliant the design, no airframe on Earth could protect its crew from a perfectly timed 88mm shell. The German gunners were no amateurs. They were veterans trained in Spain, hardened through Poland and France, and sharpened by endless nights defending the Reich. By 1941, they were no longer soldiers, they were craftsmen of destruction, calculating altitude and wind drift with slide rules and instincts honed by thousands of rounds fired into the sky. Ward pushed the throttles forward. Both Bristol Pegasus engines roared in response, each delivering 1,000 horsepower as the bomber strained toward 200 miles per hour. Speed meant survival. Altitude meant survival. Unpredictability meant survival. Behind him, the navigator muttered course corrections over the intercom. The wireless operator pressed his headphones tight against his skull. The rear gunner swept the turret in slow arcs, searching the empty blackness for night fighters that might be climbing toward them at that very moment. The air inside the aircraft reeked of warm oil, hydraulic fluid, sweat, and the unspoken knowledge that each second over Germany narrowed their chances of living through the night. And then everything ended. One moment, Ward was guiding his bomber through the dark, managing engine temperatures, fuel mixture, and Ballmeimer instructions. The next moment, an 88 mm explosive shell detonated only 16 feet ahead of the explode. The explosion ripped the front of the Wellington apart. Shrapnel tore through the fabric skin and metal framework, through instrument panels and control cables, and through human flesh with equal indifference. The cockpit was no longer a cockpit. It was a freezing, screaming void open to the night sky. Wind roared through the shattered nose, turning every loose object into a projectile. The temperature plunged instantly. At 12,000 feet, April air over northern Germany was 20 degrees below freezing, and now that air was inside the aircraft, slicing into lungs and freezing moisture on every exposed surface. Ward tried to see, but he couldn't. His face had taken shrapnel. Blood poured from his forehead, running into his eyes. The left side of his face had been torn, open skin shredded into raw meat by steel fragments. Traveling faster than bullets, pain arrived a moment later, slow, confused, as though his mind had been briefly separated from his body. The bomber dipped nose first, engines screaming, and Ward blind, bleeding, fought the controls by instinct alone. The man behind the uniform, James Allen Ward, had never imagined such a night. Born in Wanganui, New Zealand, in 1920, he grew up among rolling hills, sheep farms, and long stretches of quiet country silence. His father ran a modest farm, and James assumed he would follow the same road. University wasn't likely. Aviation seemed impossibly distant, but 1939 changed everything. When Britain declared war on Germany in September, New Zealand joined within hours, bound not only by constitutional ties, but by a sense of loyalty that had survived generations. The old country was at war, and the far-off dominions would fight beside it. The Empire Air Training Scheme soon swept up young men from across the Commonwealth, clerks, students turning them into pilots, navigators, gunners, and wireless operators. More than 130,000 would be trained across Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and southern Rhodesia. Ward volunteered early in 1940. He passed his tests not brilliantly, not poorly, simply well enough. Bomber Command didn't want miracle pilots. They needed dependable men who followed procedure, who could endure fear without breaking, who brought damaged bombers home when everything inside screamed that they wouldn't make it. Ward learned to fly on Tiger Moths in New Zealand, those forgiving biplanes that taught the basics without killing beginners too quickly. Then he sailed to Canada for advanced training, instrument flying, night operations, formation work, navigation in darkness over endless terrain. Trust your instruments, not your instincts. Believe numbers even when your eyes lie. Calculate wind drift. Correct your heading by dead reckoning. Don't lose yourself in cloud, because in operational flying, errors meant death. By early 1941, Ward was in Britain, posted to No. 75 Squadron, a New Zealand unit flying Wellington bombers from RAF Feltwell in Norfolk. Their badge bore a wedge-tailed eagle. Their motto, Ache, Ache, Kie, forever and ever be strong. Most of the men had come from farms and small towns 12,000 miles away to fight in skies neither they nor their families had ever seen. Operations were relentless. Bomber Command believed that destroying German industry from the air would weaken the war machine and avoid another generation drowning in trenches. Whether the theory was correct remained uncertain, but the raids continued. Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, the Ruhr night after night. Ward flew his first operations in March 1941. He learned quickly, because the skies taught brutally. 5% of bombers failed to return from each mission. Most crews would not live long enough to complete a 30-operation tour. Ward learned not to grow close too quickly. New faces might disappear within a week. Wellingtons took off in neat, Roseanne returned in broken fragments, or not at all. The 13th of April 1941, the mission before the Hamburg raid, the crews gathered in the briefing room, thick with cigarette smoke, damp greatcoat, and tension. The intelligence officer pulled the curtain from the wall map. The red ribbon traced a path from Norfolk across the North Sea to Hamburg. Groans filled the room. Hamburg meant heavy flak, packed searchlights, and night fighters guided by radar that grew more accurate each month. The target was oil storage tanks. Fuel Germany desperately needed. Whether anyone would actually hit the target was another question. Night bombing accuracy in early 1941 was miserable, but strategy demanded effort, and effort demanded sacrifice. Ward and his crew walked toward Wellington, R1333, climbed aboard, and took their seats. Engines roared to life. The bomber rolled down the runway and climbed into the night. Hours later, over Germany, the sky erupted, and James Ward, now blind, bleeding, half-frozen, held a dying aircraft together by will alone as the shattered Wellington plunged through the darkness. The winds were blowing strongly 20 knots from the northwest. The planned route was simple: fly north first in a dogleg pattern to avoid the known flak zones, then turn southeast toward Hamburg. On the way back there would be no such detour. Fuel was too limited for any extra miles. They would have to return straight home. Ward's crew had been flying together for 6 weeks. That was long enough to build teamwork and rhythm, but not long enough for anyone to relax or get careless. His second pilot, who occupied the right-hand seat beside him, was Sergeant Johnny Lawson, another New Zealander. Lawson was younger, capable, and improving, but still learning the 1,000 tiny decisions that separated an average pilot from one who could bring home a damaged bomber. Their navigator, Sergeant Bill Gregory, was a Londoner who had studied surveying before the war. His natural sense of direction and spatial reasoning made him ideal for deep reckoning navigation across the blacked-out continent. The wireless operator, Sergeant Tom Hughes, was a 22-year-old Welshman responsible for radio messages and listening to German frequencies for night fighter warnings. The bomb aimer, Sergeant Dennis Owen, lay in the nose during the attack, guiding Ward onto the exact release point. At the back, isolated in his cold turret, sat Sergeant Mike Carter, watching the empty sky for fighters that could appear without warning. Their aircraft R-1333 was a Mark I Charlie, driven by 2 Bristol Pegasus radial engines, producing around 1,000 horsepower each. The bomber had a 64-foot wingspan, a 60-foot length, and could reach roughly 235 miles per hour at 15,000 feet. But operational speed was kept lower to save fuel. With its standard fuel load, the Wellington could barely make the trip to Hamburg and back, leaving almost no reserves. Tonight they carried 4,000 pounds of bomb-size explosives, mixed with incendiaries hanging vertically in the geodetic bomb cells. Unlike later bombers, the Wellington carried very light defensive weapons, to Browning .303 seconds in the nose turret, 2 in the tail, and 2 in the beam positions. These rifle calibre guns were no match for German night fighters armed with cannons. The aircraft relied more on darkness, evasive flying, and the sheer size of the night sky than on firepower. Armor protection was also minimal. Only the pilots had any plating behind them. The rest of the crew had none. Every extra pound meant less fuel and fewer bombs. As dusk settled, Ward and his men walked toward R-1333. The Wellington sat on its dispersal pan, its fabric skin rippling in the wind while the ground crew finished their checks. Its squadron code letters were roughly painted, the roundels faded and patched from past missions. This bomber had already flown 23 operations, more than many crews survived. It had quirks Ward knew well. The port engine ran hot, the starboard fuel gauge read 15 gallons low, and the rudder trim always needed half a degree right to fly straight. Pre-flight checks took 20 minutes, walk-around inspection, control surfaces, fuel verification, bomb load confirmation. Everything was in order. Ward climbed through the belly hatch to the cockpit. Lawson followed. Behind them, Gregory took his place at the navigation table, Hughes at the radio, Owen in the nose, and Carter in the turret. Germany's 88mm flak, 18 guns, were the deadliest anti-aircraft weapons of the war. Precision engineering combined with brutal mathematics. Each shell weighed about 20 pounds, filled with high explosive, and traveled at over 2,000 feet per second. Upon detonation, the casing burst into hundreds of razor-sharp fragments, each traveling fast enough to slice through metal, fuel lines, cables, and tragically human bodies. The effective kill radius was around 80 feet, around Hamburg. These guns operated in coordinated batteries guided by radar and acoustic tracking. Mechanical computers calculated where each bomber would be by the time the shells reached altitude. When the bomber stream approached, the Germans built walls of exploding steel across the sky, turning survival into a matter of probability, not flying skill. The shell that struck Ward's Wellington was fired from a battery 3 miles northwest of Hamburg. The crew had tracked R-1333 for 40 seconds, adjusting for wind and speed, set the fuse for 12,000 feet, fired, and immediately began loading the next round. They were just one gun of 64, defending the city that night. The explosion occurred about 16 feet ahead of the cockpit and slightly above the nose. A shockwave hit first, faster than sound, followed by the shredding storm of fragments. The Wellington's fabric skin disintegrated instantly. The Perspex cockpit panels shattered into thousands of pieces. Instruments were smashed: altimeter, airspeed, indicator, compass, artificial horizon, all destroyed or severely damaged. Ward took the worst of it. Shrapnel tore across his face. One fragment cut into his forehead above the left eyebrow, going to the bone. Blood immediately filled his eye. Another ripped along his right cheek. Smaller pieces peppered his nose and chin. His world became red darkness, pain, overwhelming thought. His right eye still worked, but blood streamed down so heavily he could not see through it. Every time he wiped his face, he gained half a second of blurry vision before the blood returned. Lawson, partly shielded by Ward in the cockpit frame, was wounded in the shoulder and arm, but remained able to see and function. The rest of the crew, protected by the cockpit bulkhead, suffered no direct injuries, but felt the aircraft lurch violently. The Wellington itself survived thanks to its geodetic frame. Some control cables were severed. The right elevator cable was cut completely, but the left cable still worked, giving partial pitch control. Rudder cables were intact. Ailerons were damaged but functional. Hydraulic lines burst. But the flying controls didn't need hydraulics. The bomber dropped suddenly as Ward's hands left the controls when the shrapnel struck him, at 12,000 feet, descending at 800 feet per minute. They had about 15 seconds before the dive became unrecoverable. Through instinct and training, Ward groped for the control column. He could not see the instruments or anything else, but he felt the aircraft responding sluggishly. He pulled back, fighting the damaged cables, fighting the blood pouring into his eyes, fighting the shock that should have knocked him unconscious. Yet the Wellington answered him. He had kept them alive. The altimeter was gone, the airspeed indicator smashed, and the artificial horizon completely destroyed. Every instrument that could have told Ward the aircraft's attitude had been wiped out by shrapnel. He was flying purely by instinct, feeling the wind pressure tearing through the shattered cockpit, listening to the engine tone, and sensing the faint feedback that traveled up the control column from the damaged elevator. Lawson was shouting beside him. Ward could hear his voice, although the hurricane of wind roaring through the broken nose made every word difficult to understand. Within moments, Lawson had realized what had happened. Ward was blind. The captain's seat was occupied by a man who could no longer see the instruments, the sky, or even his own hands. Lawson's right arm throbbed with pain, possibly fractured, but his eyes were still working. His own instruments were mostly destroyed, but he could at least see the black earth below and the slightly lighter sky above, enough to judge which way the aircraft was tilted. They had no time to plan. They improvised instantly, the kind of desperate teamwork only moments from death can produce. Lawson would look outside, call out heading, altitude, and power changes. Ward would translate those spoken instructions into control movements, flying the Wellington with nothing but trust in Lawson's eyes and his own muscle memory. The wireless operator. Hughes pushed his way into the ruined cockpit, shining a small torch onto the fragments of instruments on Lawson's side. A few gauges still worked. The magnetic compass was intact. One cluster of engine instruments was partially readable. The fuel gauges might be correct or might be lying. Ward needed information he could no longer get visually. Altitude mattered. Too low meant hitting the sea or ground. Too high burned fuel they couldn't spare. Airspeed was critical, slow enough to stall, fast enough to tear the aircraft apart. Heading was life or death, because without the correct direction, they could wander over the North Sea until the tanks ran dry. And engine performance had to be watched constantly. If either Pegasus failed, the damaged Wellington would never stay aloft. Lawson read the surviving instruments as best he could. They were at 9,000 feet, having fallen nearly 3,000 in the post-hit dive. Their airspeed had been dangerously high, and although Ward had leveled the aircraft, they were still around 180 miles per hour fleeable, but far from ideal. They were pointed northeast, completely wrong for returning to England. Either the dive had spun them, or earlier evasive maneuvers had thrown off their course. Fuel was uncertain. The gauges were damaged, but they estimated they had burned about half their fuel by the time they reached Hamburg. That left maybe 90 minutes of flying. Navigator Gregory began his calculations, working on his unbroken table with undamaged charts. He used dead reckoning estimating their drift, time, and speed. Without stars, without ground lights, without radar, his math was their only guide. Though each correction carried built-up error, after working through the numbers, he gave them a heading: due west, 270. If the wind cooperated, that should eventually bring them back to Ward, the North Sea, and home. Ward banked the Wellington left, guided by Lawson's steady stream of shouted corrections. Ease it. Hold it there. Too much rudder. Straighten up. Steady now. It felt like Ward was learning to fly all over again, like an instructor was talking him through every movement. Except he had 500 hours, 20 operations, and now was forced to fly like a trainee, because his eyes were full of blood that wouldn't stop flowing. The North Sea sprawled beneath them, 90 miles of pure black water, featureless and deadly. No lights, no ships, no visible horizon. Only Gregory's calculations stood between them and total loss. He plotted their imagined track on the chart, adjusting for winds that had shifted since the pre-mission briefing. They always shifted, without fixes from the stars or ground. His position updates were educated guesses, supported by experience and fear. They turned west around midnight. The bomb load, 4,000 pounds, still hung beneath them. Owen suggested dropping it to lighten the aircraft, as was standard after taking damage. But Gregory ran the numbers. With the hydraulics failed, jettisoning manually would take time, and the fuel saved might not compensate for the trouble. They decided to keep the bombs. If fate allowed, they would bring them home. Ward fought the controls. The damaged elevator cables made the aircraft respond unevenly. Pulling back produced different reactions depending on bank angle. The stiff, wounded ailerons required constant pressure. His arms burned from effort, but letting go even for a moment meant drifting off course or slipping into a bank. He could not see Dot, so he flew by Lawson's voice alone. Right wing low corrected. You're climbing nose down. Too much. Bring it back. Steady. At around 12:30, Hughes noticed the port engine behaving oddly. The flames from the exhaust flickered wrong. Lawson checked what gauges remained: cylinder, temperature rising, oil pressure dipping, RPM unstable. Shrapnel had probably damaged something deep inside, a fuel line, an oil passage, or a cooling path. Ward reduced power to save the engine. Their speed dropped to 150 miles per hour, safer for fuel, slower for progress. Gregory recalculated once more. If nothing else went wrong, they might reach the English coast close to dawn. It was a chain of fragile ifs, each capable of killing them. The cold was becoming torture. At 9,000 feet, the outside air hovered around 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and with the cockpit ripped open, the freezing wind blasted straight through. Their heated suits tried to compensate, but no electric garment could protect them from that direct exposure. Their faces went numb, then slowly turned to Ward, frostbite. Ward's blood had dried in brittle streaks across his cheeks, frozen around his eyes, stiffening in his hair, and still he flew. His entire world had narrowed to Lorson Kieo's Uski guidance, or uncontrols ka hulka sazinda, field jo abi buskoth tak ponch rahatha, engines key vibration, fuselage key, thartharit, or hawaka kula joka jo sita, uske chair, parpad rahathayahi, teen chi sin, usko batati, thiki, aircraft kiss, speed par, chal raha high, bakitamam. Esaas. Aktaraf. Huchukte, Surf Suna, Samajina, or Lorsen Ki, commands KO Tarant movement, main Badal Nayahi, Uski Zindagi Kabacha, Kuchadera, Tha, 100 feet, airspeed 95 knots. Perfect. Tum Thori Hi Ho. Power Com Karo, Nos Toda Sanish, Lorsen Kiawa Steady Thi Lakino Scar. Las Main US. Tenshia Wasan. Thajo, Surf Mode K. Bilkalo. Kariblog. Masuskart. Hain Port Engine. Adela Hachana, C. Hanhanti Hui. Awas Nikali. Word Ni, Tarant Mazuz, Kia Throttle, Kanich, Seguzarta, Woe, Compulsion. Woe Vibration, Joe Batata, High K, ABE, Ya, Engine Apney, Akri Sansan, Laraha, High, 90 miles tack Ya Zakmi Engine Chal, Rahatha Gut Car, Ab, Woe Bilkal, Aunt Key, Head Par Tha. Lorsen Chica, Port Engine Giving Up, Speed Hold Caro, Your Sinking Pull, Back. Wellington A, 90 miles per hour, Parsida Zaman Key, Taraf, Araha, Tha, Ek Engine Bond, Flaps Nahon, Kiwaja Se Descent, Ko Rakna, Kakoi, Tarika Nahi, AUR Cockpit, Main, Ake, and a pilot Joe Surf, Awazpar, Chel, Rahatha, Agar Hisab, Lagaya J2 ISS, Landing, Kachance, Shayad, 0, K, Barabar, Hota, Lekin Hisaab, Kitab, Tutab, Khatam, Hogayata, Jabwo, Shalunke, Cockpit, Kakuda Kargayatha. Unhon her? Dafamot, Kayodaka, Diatha, Jama, Astive Main, North Sea Par, and here Main, or Ab, Runway Key Simt, Gertie Hoy Machine, Key Ender, 20 feet, Lorsen Kia Waz, AB Steel, Key Terra, Tight-Ho, Gay, Power, Tumboet, Jaldi, Nietzsche, Rehi Hanos Up, 10 feet, Throttle, Now, Ward Knee, Tono Throttles Jotki, Say Age, Dekal Die, Starboard Engine Nietzsche Kari Spond, Kia Port Engine, Adelawahi Doomtod D, Asymmetric Thrust Knee Plane KO, Zor Say Bahain, Gumana Chaha, Leakin Ward, Knee Right, Rudder, Puri Takat Say Daba, Dia, Plane Sita Hua, 5 feet, Hold it, or Fear Wheels Knee, Concrete Kochua, Ek, Carrara, Zinda Jatka, Rubber Key Chilling Scream, Gear K Struts, KA Pura, Airframe, Main, Dardnock, SA, Echo, Leakin, Control Tha, Jitna, Hona, Chehi, Tha, Utna, Zarur, Tha, Tailwheel, Nietzsche, Ia, Jab, Speed, Got Car, Survivable, Hoge, Ward Knee Brakes, Dabe Damage the Leakin Kumkar Rehi, the Wellington Ek Taraf Hinch Rahafa Cockpit Chate. Hua Nose. Port Engine Dead. Starboard Engine Key Residual Thrust, Sab Milkar Aircraft, Ko Boine, Dekal Rehi, the Dot Ward, Nihar, Second Right Rudder, Right Brake, Pressure Adjustments, Kartaraha, Milesikan Kahisahap Salorsen Chikraha. Ta. You're drifting, correct more right? Hold it. 3,000 feet runway Bacha Tha. Speed and umpooling patch. Taye. Chukithi. Hari 40 miles per hour on Han. Brakes or drag. Say Porky. Fear 20 miles per hour. Fear 10. Or Fear. Whoa. Rook. Gay Dot. Wellington Q Engine Band. Cockpit Main Surf Hawa Ka Gusna. Or Garam. Ka Tick Tick. Ward Kutch Paltak Hilaya Nahi. Uski Unglian controls Parjam C Gai. Thi. Damag. ABB. Lorsen K. Last Command. KO Process Car. Rahatha Highs. Aircraft ABB. Hawa. Main Ho. Fear USN Deer, Se Column Choda, Hothlap Parhita. Delay. Andehera. Fela. Hua. Likanawazan, Se Use Pata, La Graha, Tha Log Door, Rehi Hain, Crash Crew, AA, Raha Hai, Ambulance, Kigante, Ground Staff, Kichik, Car Instructions, Lorsen Ni, Halka, Sehansi, Mila Kar, Kaha, Ward, Hum Zinda, Uter, Gay Hain, Hum Ni Kardia, Crew, Ek, Karke, Kopid, Ki Taraf, Baga Owen Subs, Behel Aya, USN Ward Kachera, Tikapura, Kanse Jama, Hua, Cantabare Zakman, Kanaksha, Uski Sands Attack Gay, Peach Gregory or Hughes, AA Gay, Carter Turret Say, Chad Kar Ia, Wo, Sabruk, Gay Cockpit Katava, Shishi Hawa, Kasida Jonka, Engine Dead, or Fear Be Ya, Subout K, Ya, Aircraft, 90 miles Chalkar, Yahan AAYA, Medical Officer, 2-minute main, Pahanch Gaya, Torch Key, Roshni, Main Ward, K. Zakman, Kajaza, Leah, Sarfata Hua, Mathi Par, Jirah, Jedgal, Par Lamba, Tier, Mpod Blus, Stitches, Par 20 Cheek, Par Chot, Tukt, Usk, Chair Par, Beaker Hugh, the Sab's Surgical Removal Demand Cart, Hugh, Leakin, Aski Ankan Batch, Keiti, Andera, Jo Usne, Deja Tawo, Asli, Andapan, Naita, Sirfkun, swelling or trauma. Tendon Minuski Roshni Puri Wapas, Agi Gaylorsen Ka fractured arm. Thiko Gaya, Crew K Baki, Log physically Theek, mentally Thaki, Hugh, Magar, Sab, Zinda, .sab, Ek AC Landing, K-Bod, Jahan Bacha, Hua Chance, 0 Sabi, Calm, Hota, High. Ward's entire universe had narrowed to 3 sensations. Lorsen's voice in his headset, the trembling aircraft controls beneath his blood-stiffened fingers, and the relentless vibration rumbling through the Wellington's wounded airframe. Every other sense, sight, smell, even pain, had faded into the background, replaced by instinct and training sharpened by desperation. He could no longer see. His world had become a tunnel of sound and touch. 100 feet, airspeed, 95 knots. Lorsen's voice was controlled, taut, carrying the fragile calm of a man who knew that survival depended entirely on precision. Ward adjusted the control column, the movement small but exact. He could feel the wind pressure across his cheeks, could sense their speed in the changes of airflow against his ruined cockpit. Even blind, even bleeding, he could tell when the aircraft dipped too sharply or rose too quickly. His hearing had become his navigation system. His body was the instrument panel. You're high, reduce power, ease it forward. Not too much. Ward nudged the throttles, but the instant he touched the left one, he felt it a shudder, a cough, a subtle vibration that told him the port engine was reaching the end of its endurance. 90 miles ago, it had been damaged by the flak shell that tore through the cockpit. For hours it had run rough, protesting every rotation. Now it was dying. Lorsen saw it before Ward felt it. Port engines dropping, props slowing, exhaust as white sheaves failing. Ward already knew. He could feel the fading heartbeat of the engine through the throttle quadrant. Fuel starvation. Minutes of fuel left, maybe seconds. He dared not add power to compensate. Maintain speed. You're sinking. Back pressure 50 feet. The Wellington dropped toward the runway at 90 miles per hour. One engine failing. No flaps. A blind pilot. And a descent angle too steep to correct easily. But mathematics didn't matter. They had already survived too much. The cockpit explosion, the loss of all instruments, the blackout over the North Sea. The 90-mile flight through darkness with a half-dead aircraft. One more impossibility almost seemed trivial now. 20 feet. Lawson's voice cracked with urgency. Power. You're sinking fast. Raise the nose. Ward pushed the throttles forward. The starboard engine surged. The port engine wheezed, sputtered, and died with a final metallic shudder. Asymmetric thrust twisted the Wellington sharply left. Ward reacted instantly right rudder. More right rudder, feeling the aircraft straighten through vibration alone. His sense of balance had become more valuable than any instrument. 10 feet. Throttle now hold her. He brought the nose up. The aircraft floated, hanging on the edge of the stall. 5 feet. Lawson's voice was nearly a shout. Ward held it. Feeling the Wellington's weight shift, the strange lightness that signaled the moment before contact. Ease back. Hold it off. You're there. The main wheels struck concrete at 92 miles per hour. The tires screamed as rubber bit into runway surface. Shock reverberated through the Wellington's geodetic frame, traveling up the seat, through Ward's ribs, into the bones of his skull. He felt the tail wheels settle, then instinctively went to the brakes. The aircraft slowed but pulled left violently. The collapsed nose section was acting like a crude air brake on one side, and with the port engine dead, the drag imbalance worsened every second. You're tracking left. Right rudder. More. Correct? Lawson's running commentary was the only guide Ward had. He tapped the right brake, eased off the left, fought the aircraft's stubborn turning tendency. Every correction was a guess, an adjustment based entirely on feel. His world was pressure, vibration, and the fading whine of the starboard propeller windmilling as its fuel mixture cut off. Speed 60. Still fast, hold her straight. They had 3,000 feet of runway left, enough if nothing else failed. At 40 miles per hour, the Wellington reached taxi speed, though its motion still felt uneven, unstable. Ward's hands, shaking now from exhaustion and blood loss, kept working the controls. His boots pressed the pedals, coaxing the aircraft to stay centered. 20 miles per hour. 10-5. Then, finally, dash stillness. The Wellington rolled to a complete stop, silent, except for the cooling tick of hot metal. For the first time in hours, Ward allowed his hands to fall to his lap. He sat motionless, chest heaving, mind still listening for instructions that no longer came. He couldn't see. Not a shadow, not a blur. His face was a stiff mask of dried blood, swelling, shredded skin. But he could hear voices, boots running, shouts, the crash tender and ambulance approaching, the clang of the medical bell. He heard Lawson's voice, hoarse from shouting for 90 miles. We're down. We made it. Ward, we're alive. The crew climbed forward, one by one, Gregory, Hughes, Carter. They froze when they saw Ward's face. Blood, shredded metal, the cockpit that had been nearly destroyed, and the impossible reality that Ward had flown and landed the aircraft blind. The medical officer arrived within minutes, torch in hand. He inspected Ward's face. Hours-old wounds, clotted, but still seeping, shrapnel-torn tissue, lacerations everywhere. Lawson's arm also needed treatment. Fragments had torn through muscle. Ward spent 3 weeks in hospital, where surgeons repaired the damaged 14 stitches above his left eyebrow, 20 across his cheek, dozens of small cuts that would scar forever. Miraculously, his eyes were unharmed. The blindness had been caused by blood and swelling, not damage to the eyes themselves. Within 10 days, his vision returned, but the memory of flying blind through darkness, engines dying, would remain forever. Lawson's arm fractured cleanly, just below the shoulder, required immobilization rather than surgery. The doctors set the bone, fitted it into a rigid sling, and told him he was lucky. The shrapnel fragments had missed arteries and nerves by millimeters. He would fly again, they said. And he did. 6 weeks later, he returned to operational status, stiff-shouldered, but determined, carrying inside him the permanent reminder of that night, the dull ache of embedded metal fragments that surgeons refused to remove. The pieces were too deep, lodged against muscle and bone in risky places. They remained there for the rest of his life, harmless but visible on X-rays, like tiny stars frozen beneath the skin. The rest of the crew required no treatment, beyond observation mild shock, ringing ears, and patches of frostbite across exposed fingers and faces. That, in itself, bordered on miraculous. Men had died for far less. The Wellington R-1133 never flew again. When ground crews inspected it in daylight, the full extent of the damage became clear. Under the harsh glow of the hangar lamps, the aircraft resembled a wounded animal that had somehow dragged itself home. The entire nose section forward of the cockpit bulkhead had been shredded. Fabric hung in tatters, metal tubing bent like broken ribs. The cockpit's side windows were gone, the forward canopy ripped away. Most of the instrument panel had been smashed by shrapnel or torn free by the explosions. Shockwave control cables showed multiple impact scar strands snapped, others frayed to the point of near failure. Hydraulic lines were perforated throughout the forward fuselage, oozing fluid. The port engine cowling alone held 17 distinct shrapnel holes. One had sliced an oil line, causing the rough vibration Ward had sensed during the 90-mile return flight. The airframe had taken so much structural punishment that repair was deemed pointless. Economically unjustifiable, the report said. R-1133 was struck off charge, reduced to salvage. Mechanics dismantled the geodetic skeleton with saws and torches, stripping usable parts to keep other Wellingtons flying. The bomber that had protected its crew through impossible odds was broken down to feed the fleet an unceremonious but necessary end. Formal debriefing occurred after Ward left the hospital. Intelligence officers gathered around a long table, notebooks and typewriters ready, wanting clarity for operational analysis. Ward, still bandaged, described the mission without drama. He spoke gently, as if recounting the events of another man's life. Flak burst at 12,000 feet. Cockpit destroyed. Facial injuries. Blind navigation. Landing on verbal instruction. Lorson corroborated every detail, adding technical notes regarding control, difficulty, instrument loss, throttle response, and the sickening instability created by the asymmetric thrust of a dying engine. Gregory presented navigation logs, showing the dead reckoning calculations that had carried them across the North Sea, with no compass, no altimeter, no airspeed indicator, just mathematics, instinct, and a belief that they could not afford to die yet. The officers typed everything into reports that traveled upward through Bomber Command headquarters. It would become part of the data stream that shaped tactics, training, and survival models. Their survival was remarkable, but not unique. Bomber Command accumulated impossible stories throughout the war. Aircraft limping home, with entire tail sections gone. Halifaxes returning on a single engine. Lancasters, whose pilots died mid-flight. Their bodies slumped forward in positions that miraculously kept the controls trimmed. Sterlings held aloft by sheer luck, and ailerons twisted into accidental stability. In a war filled with thousands upon thousands of sorties, statistical outliers became inevitable, even common. The mathematics of attrition were merciless. In April 1941, Bomber Command's loss rate averaged 4.9% per operation. A crew required to fly 30 operations, the length of a standard tour faced a cumulative probability of death or capture exceeding 70%. Most never completed their tours. Ward's own squadron, No. 75, would lose 37 aircraft between April 1940 and the end of 1943. Those 37 bombers carried 259 men. 163 of them died. 61 became prisoners. Only 35 survived through skill, chance, or miracles like the one that brought R-1133 home. Ward returned to operations that June, His face had healed enough to pass medical requirements. Scars remained, thin white lines running along his cheek and eyebrow, permanent reminders of metal that had passed close to the bone. But his vision was sharp again, and he insisted on flying. He completed 16 more missions before ending his tour in September. Afterward, he spent months as an instructor, teaching new pilots the same calm precision that had saved his crew. Students listened differently to him. They knew his story. They knew he had landed blind. His soft-spoken instructions carried the weight of experience few could imagine. He survived the war, returned to New Zealand in 1945, married the year after, farmed sheep on the North Island, as he had intended before the war, interrupted youth, and replaced it with duty. He raised children, built fences, sheared wool, lived quietly. He died in 1986, aged 60-6-40-1 years after the night. He should have died over the North Sea. The Wellington bomber itself faded into history by 1943. Larger four-engine heavies, Halifaxes, Sterlings took its place. But the Wellington had served everywhere, and in numbers unmatched by any other British bomber. 11,461 were built. Many returned home with holes big enough to crawl through. The geodetic construction, Barnes-Wallace's ingenious lattice framework, had kept them alive when logic said they shouldn't be. Wallace's structural philosophy, distributed stress, absorbed impact, transferred load across the frame with resilience no traditional design could match. Post-war aircraft abandoned geodetics for monocoque constructional, lighter, more efficient, entirely unsuited to the brutal demands of combat. Peace cared more for economy than survivability. But for the men who had flown through flak and fighters over Europe, the geodetic structure was a guardian angel of metal and geometry. Ward's story became a footnote in Bomber Command's sprawling history, one mission among thousands, one crew among tens of thousands. Yet it illustrated a fundamental truth about aerial warfare. Survival depended less on machinery or tactics, and more on human resolve, on the refusal to die, on the stubborn insistence that some impossible challenges must be met simply because surrender was not an option. When the flak burst, tore through the cockpit, Ward had faced a choice: bail out and hope for rescue, order his crew to abandon the aircraft, except that a blind pilot could not fly 90 miles across the sea and land safely. Instead, he chose the alternative. He kept flying. He trusted Lawson's eyes and his own hands, trusted the Wellington's wounded frame to stay together a little longer, trusted the accumulated reflexes of 500 hours. Behind a control column, that choice repeated thousands of times by bomber crews throughout the war explain why Britain's air offensive continued, despite losses that would have shattered any rational military force. The men simply refused to stop.